Hey everybody, my name is Quinn the GM. I've been playing and running 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons for about 5 years now, and in that time I've played a few characters, but I've had a lot of players and I've had a lot of player characters in my games. So today I thought it'd be fun to go through a list of all of the classes in 5th edition and rank them based on how powerful they've been in my games, how powerful I think they are just generally, both based on my experience as a player and as a DM, though the latter is a lot more prevalent than the former, as I'm a DM a lot more often than I'm a player. Overall, this is very much going to be my opinion. You very much could disagree, and I think that that's pretty reasonable on a few of these counts because I have not had great representation from a few of these classes, but I'd love to hear your opinion, so leave a comment below if it differs from mine or if you agree with me. I'd love to hear either or. Also, be sure to subscribe if you enjoy, and yeah, let's jump into it. I thank you all for watching. I'm going to experiment a bit with the formatting of this, so let's dive in here. We should now have the face cam up. I'm getting more adept at this whole video making thing. But first up, we have the Artificer. This is a new one. I've only had one Artificer in any of my games, and it's in my current campaign, which is quite fun. I was surprised by how much I liked this. The Artificer is a class that I myself have had some trouble wrapping my head around. I learned the early UA rule set for them way back when, but overall I didn't really jive with the current edition of them until I started having a player who used one. They're an Alchemist, which I've always heard is one of the weakest Artificer subclasses, if not listed as one of the weakest subclasses in 5th edition, and I have no idea where that comes from. Alchemist provides such amazing healing here, and if it's the weakest, I think that Artificer is a fairly powerful class, but based purely on my experience in my games, I'm going to put Artificer as a solid B tier. I do not have a ton of experience, so that's kind of limiting that, but I do think that the possibilities there are quite exciting. I'd love to play one myself someday, though I never have. Barbarian, this is another one I've had only a couple of. Overall, I think Barbarian is good. I think that what it does exceedingly well. Those being melee damage and tanking, and that is about it. Everything else Barbarian is not really great at. Subclasses for Barbarian tend to dip into one of those two things, or they tend to amend some of those weaknesses that it has. I know the Wild Magic Barbarian tends to do that. Overall, I think because of this lack of versatility, Barbarian could be considered a little bit less powerful than other classes, particularly given how martial classes tend to scale in 5th edition worse than spellcasting classes generally. So for that reason, also for reference, the main Barbarian that I've had in my campaigns was a Bear Totem Barbarian, and even then there were a lot of very strong weaknesses throughout the kit, and I know that Bear Totem is probably the strongest Barbarian subclass. So Barbarian is going to go into the C tier initially here. Bard. Bard is a good one. I've not had many of these either because players tend to just steer away from it and prefer other charisma casters that we'll get to here in a second. But I think that Bard is quite powerful in terms of what it can do. It's the best jack of all trades in the game, in my opinion. It can do a wide variety of spellcasting things. The subclasses each provide a unique flavor, and the thing that I like most about the subclasses is the ability to use inspiration in varying ways between each of them. I also really like Lore Bard for being able to pick up more spells from any spell list and more skills, which is quite cool. And for all of this combined, in addition to being a full spellcaster with some of the best proficiencies in the game, I'm going to put Bard in a solid A tier. Warlock. If we were going on plot relevance and importance in my campaigns, Warlock would be above S tier. They've been incredibly important to the story of all of my main campaigns so far, and it's been really fun having them in the game. That said, they're not the most powerful. They tend to just sort of devolve into an Eldritch Blast machine in most cases, or an Eldritch Smite machine if you're Hexblade, which I have had one of. Overall, I do think that it's a good class. I don't think it's very bad, but I think it tends to kind of be hamstrung by the design of 5th edition, steering away from short rests as time goes on. I'm excited to see what this class is going to end up in 5.5 or 6e, because in the next edition of D&D, it seems like they're moving away from the short rest concept with all of these subclasses, tosses, and on. And I'm excited to see what they do with the Warlock for that, as the core design of the class, I think, is some of the most interesting in the game, if it's not the most powerful, necessarily. So for that, I'm going to put it at the top of B tier, above Artificer, but below Bard. Bloodhunter. This is the one that I've had a few times. It's Matt Mercer's homebrew. You can find it on D&D Beyond. I think it's really cool. It's really intricate. I would not recommend it to a new player because it is, as I said, quite intricate, a lot to get a handle on. I think it's Very good for what it wants to do, particularly melee combat. It's a martial class, which is quite good, and it also has an interesting degree of kind of not quite spellcasting, though one subclass can do that. It allows the Blood Hunter to essentially dip into these almost spells, like Blood Maledict and whatnot. I don't have a ton of experience with this. I've played one. I've had a few in my games. I'm going to put it bottom of B tier, I think. I think that's pretty fitting. I don't think it's worse than the Barbarian, but I don't think it's better than the Artificer. Okay, Cleric. First S tier, easily. Clerics are a lot. They have insane spellcasting, both the best healing options in the game and some of the best utility and damage options in the game, in addition to having access to the entirety of the spell list at any given time. All you need is a long rest. On top of Channel Divinities, on top of Armor Proficiencies, it's insanity, all of the stuff the Clerics get access to. Fun fact, Cleric is the one class in my games that I will never allow to reach level 20 at any point, at least if I'm playing in my main homebrew world that I've been making lore for about 5 years now. Primarily because Clerics level 20 gain the ability to just do their Channel Divinity whenever they want. Once per week, just it works. It's insanity. The ability to just call a god to do your bidding at any given time once a week is more powerful than anything else in the game. At least Wish has the ability to just stop being able to cast it, which kind of limits wizards and sorcerers in that way. But overall, Clerics, between the armor, between the healing, potential for great variation between the subclasses as well. There are subclasses that are great martial capabilities. There are spellcasting focused subclasses. Overall, I just think it's amazing. And overall, I think most parties should probably have a Cleric, though it's definitely not as necessary to have that strict healer as it was when 5e started out, as now Druids get access to Revivify, which is great. But yeah, speaking of, moving on to the Druid, I've not had a ton of these in my games either. Overall, I think the Druids are also quite powerful. To get the same kind of wisdom spellcasting that you're able to swap between at a long rest the entire spell list as the Cleric, though overall I think the spell list is generally a bit weaker, save for like 9th level, which gets access to Shape Change, which is a fantastic spell. Wild Shape is interesting. I think I like a lot of what they're doing with it in recent subclasses, particularly in Tasha's with Wildfire Spirits and Circle of Stars. However, I think some of the earlier subclasses, like the Circle of the Land, can be quite a bit weaker, whereas Moon Druid is great at tanking in the early levels, but it does kind of fall off as you hit the higher tiers of gameplay. Overall, I think Druid is one of the more powerful classes in the game. I don't think it quite breaks S tier. I think it's close. I think it's probably the closest class to S tier on this list, but it's still very, very powerful. Fighter's a fun one. I think it's often underrated and often written off as a class kind of for beginners, for newcomers, and I think that's a bit simplistic. I think that Battlemaster is something that is generally quite underrated. Orm is doing a great job of it in Critical Role right now, in that you essentially get just spells they're able to cast with your sword that enemies won't have magic resistance to. You can trip them, you can disarm them, you can move them, you can distract them from your allies, you can guard your allies. It's great. The Fighter also has some of the most versatile subclasses in the entire game. Echo Knight is incredibly powerful. I'm sure there are a million videos on here as to how they're so powerful. In addition to my personal favorite, which is the Rune Knight, getting access to a similar unique kind of magic. There's also the Eldritch Knight, a lot of knights in Fighter. But all of them are quite unique and quite interesting. Overall, for my money, the weakest subclass for Fighter is the Arcane Archer, who only gets like an arrow or two a day, which really isn't great. But overall, I think Fighters are quite powerful and probably one of the more powerful melee classes in 5th edition. I'm going to put it, it's solid B. I think I'm going to put it between Warlock and Artificer. Next up is the Sorcerer. Sorcerer is another tricky one to judge. It has improved vastly in recent years, especially with the new subclasses in Tasha's. The Aberrant Mind and the Clockwork Soul do a lot to fix what was wrong with previous Sorcerer subclasses and why they were so much weaker than Wizards. However, those previous subclasses need to be taken into account. They still exist. They're still really cool ideas that players might get shackled to if their character demands it. I think Sorcerer is kind of a budget wizard in my mind, and that tends to be what players tend to play it as, at least in my games. And for that, I don't think it's like the most powerful. I think it's top of C tier, I'll call it. Above the Barbarian, but not great overall. Wizard, on the other hand, quite good. I'm going to say easy A tier. Some of the most versatile spellcasting in the game. The ability to add spells to your spellbook is always really fun. The subclasses all being focused on different schools of magic from the player's handbook is also quite interesting, and I like the ways it expands in subtle ways off the typical just plain wizard aesthetic generally. Overall, I think that there's been a bit of a lull in wizard subclasses since Xanathar's and Tasha's. I really haven't been inspired by either of those, save for Bladesinger. Bladesinger's great. But overall, that doesn't really distract from the power level of the wizard. I think that it's more versatile than the bard, other than not being able to heal, which can be addressed with feats, which is why it's above it, but not as versatile as the druid, because it does not have anything like wild shape or anything on that power level. Monk is another one that people tend to think is underpowered, and I am inclined to generally agree with that. I think that the monk is certainly good. I think that there are elements of it that if you know what you want to do and you focus on that, you can do it. But I don't think it does anything better than any other class in the game, other than like movement, which is generally something that can be amended by like a wizard's spells, or a rogue can just cunning action dash and outpace them anyway. I think that the monk has some interesting subclasses, particularly the open hand has been just really doing me a number in recent games, as any of my players can attest. The ability to take away reactions is great. And Stunning Strike, as many people have said, is fantastic, but that really is one of the few things the class has going for it. I'm going to have to put Monk... this is tricky. Okay. I'm going to put Monk in C tier and bump Barbarian down to D. I think that seems fair. I think the Monk generally has more to do than the Barbarian, which is just pure damage, and in terms of pure damage is outclassed by a lot of classes in the game. Paladin is up next, another easy S tier. I have a Paladin in my current game, and it is insanity the things that he can do. The healing, the melee, the smites, it can truly just do it all. Anything that you need to do, you can have the Paladin do, essentially. And the variety in the oaths and the idea of just the roleplay potential that they have are fantastic overall, and I really love that. Paladin's my favorite class. I'm biased. I made a favorite classes video. You should go watch that as well. But I just think it's a fantastic class. It's also the class I played for the longest. I played a Paladin for like 2.5 years, and that was a ton of fun. Rogue is up next, and rogues are underrated, man. I think they're the most powerful martial class. I think they're bottom of A tier. Rogues' number one most valuable resource that they make better use of than the monks generally, in my opinion, at least in my experience as a DM, is evasion. That gives them a degree of tankiness that is pretty much unmatched, and combined that with uncanny dodge allows them to essentially have any damage they take. It's insanity. The thing is, Monk wants to be that tanky. It has things like deflect missiles, but that is super situational. And overall, because it's lacking those resources, I really think the Monk should just have a D10 hit dice instead of a D8. If that were the case, it'd probably be top of B tier. But as it stands, it's really not that powerful. Rogue gets some of the best movement in the game with cunning action, the ability to hide really well, skill expertise, which I love on any class. Sneak attack is a great single target, immediate burst of damage, which can be great for concentration or bursting on any individual enemy. Yeah, I just really like it. Gunslinger, I don't know why that's on here. That's just a subclass. I also don't know what that triangle is. That means our last class is one of the more controversial in the game, and my placement of it might be as well. I think the Ranger is solid, middle of the pack, B tier. I think that with the buffs it got in Tasha's, with the optional changes for the classes, it is far and away better than it once was. The changes to Beastmaster have been fantastic, and I really, really enjoy the elements that they've woven in to give it skill expertise and more better spellcasting, more better. I'm really not doing great with grammar today, but regardless of that, I think the Ranger is really flavorful and can provide a lot of really good damage, and the fact that they're able to focus more on range damage, something that no other martial class really focuses on in 5th edition so far. So this has been my rankings so far. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe and like if you enjoyed. And yeah, thank you all for watching.